So camera lenses can be super confusing at first. Like, what do all of these numbers mean on the lens? What's the best lens for beginners? Which one should you choose if you're a photographer or you're into video? There's lots of questions. So in this video, let's break down everything there is to know about lenses for beginners.
You gotta just press record.
So starting off, what does a lens even do? Well, a camera lens allows light to pass through different pieces of glass called lens elements. And these elements are designed to bend light to focus the light on hitting your camera sensor at a particular spot, thus creating your image. So without a lens, your DSLR or mirrorless camera is practically useless. Now, all cameras leverage a specific mounting system to attach your lens to your camera body, and each brand is going to have its own lens mounting system. So Sony right here uses the E-mount system. So these cameras can only take lenses that are made for the E-mount, and this is whether or not you're buying a Sony branded lens or third-party lenses from companies like Tamron, Sigma, or here's a Viltrox lens right here, and it's an E-mount lens, so I can screw this directly on to a Sony E-mount camera, and it works just fine. Now what's weird is a company like Canon for their older DSLRs use the EF mount, while their newer line of mirrorless cameras use the RF mount. So even within the same camera company, there's sometimes different mounts that these cameras use. So you have to make sure that you purchase the right lens for the right camera. There are some lens mount converters out there, but there are quite a few trade-offs when you start trying to like put a Canon lens on a Sony body and stuff. So I would typically steer clear of that and just purchase the appropriate lens for your camera type. Now, one of the most important factors for any lens is its focal length, and every lens has a focal length that's expressed in millimeters, and you'll see this on the lens as mm. You might see 20 millimeters or 50 millimeters or even a range like 70 to 200 millimeters. These are all different focal lengths. Now, focal lengths are important for a few different reasons, and the first is that it determines your field of view, otherwise known as FOV. So this is how much of your scene is going to be captured. How wide is your shot going to be, or how tight will your shot be? Focal lengths with a wider FOV are things like 11 millimeters, 16 millimeters, and 20 millimeters, and these are great for showcasing wide scenes like landscapes or buildings, or even recording in smaller studio spaces like I'm in right now. I'm actually using a 20 millimeter lens in my loft studio space. Now, focal lengths with a medium field of view are things like 35 millimeters or 50 or 70 millimeters, and these are great for everyday shooting and just filling a variety of needs. And then focal lengths with a tighter field of view are things like 85 millimeters or 105 or 200 millimeters and beyond. These are known as telephoto lenses, and these are great for capturing subjects that are further away from your camera, like wildlife photography or sports content or concerts and more. So that's how your focal length affects your different fields of view. Now, focal length will also determine your lens compression, and compression is the effect where objects in the background appear to almost be closer to your subject when you're using longer focal lengths like telephoto lenses. And this happens because telephoto lenses narrow your field of view like we talked about, but they also magnify distant objects, and they make the background seem larger and closer to your subject than a wide angle lens would. So just know that when you use a longer focal length, your image is going to look more compressed. Now, the third main factor that focal length affects is lens distortion, and wider focal lengths will tend to be a little bit more distorted, and they're going to make the world seem almost like stretched out or expanded. Sometimes even straight lines like buildings are going to start looking curved with these wider focal lengths. And then tighter focal lengths, on the other hand, tend to minimize distortion, keeping lines more straight, and overall your image will just look more natural when you use these tighter lenses. Now, all lenses fall under two different categories. You have prime lenses and you have zoom lenses. And prime lenses have a fixed focal length, so their focal lengths cannot be changed. So a 50 millimeter lens like this is only going to give you that 50 millimeter field of view. And if you want to get closer or even wider from your subject, you have to physically move your camera to recompose your image. They also usually have fewer elements inside of them and usually can produce sharper images than zoom lenses. And finally, they also usually have the ability to have a wider open aperture value for shooting in low light situations and just getting a shallower depth of field. Now, zoom lenses, on the other hand, can vary their focal length by adjusting different lens elements with zoom. So a common zoom range with a zoom lens would be something like this. This is a 24 to 70 zoom, or you might see a 70 to 200 telephoto lens, but there's a wide range of zoom lenses out there. Zoom lenses are certainly more versatile than prime lenses for quickly getting different types of shots like wides, mids, and tights, but these lenses are also often less sharp than prime lenses because they have more elements and more complexity to them. They also often have an aperture that doesn't open as wide as a prime lens does, and it's common to see a maximum aperture on a zoom lens be f2.8 or 3.5 or f4, which will just let in a little bit less light. Is one of these style of lenses better than the other? Well, not really. It kind of just depends on what you're going for. If you want the sharpest possible results, then you probably would need to use a prime lens. If you want more versatility and you're more on the go and you need to recompose different kinds of shots quickly, then you need to go for a zoom lens. It all just kind of depends on your specific needs, and your needs might change depending on what you're shooting. Now let's talk about aperture, and aperture controls how much light enters your camera through the lens and also affects your depth of field. And it's measured in what's called f-stops, like f1.8 or f16, and you'll typically see these f-stop values actually on your lens most of the time. A lower f-stop number like f1.8 creates a really wide aperture opening, which lets in a ton of light for your camera sensor, which particularly can help in lower light situations. And an aperture of 1.8 is also going to produce a really shallow depth of field. So this is going to give you that really nice blurry background for beautiful looking shots. It's great for isolating a subject from the background, or for YouTube videos like this one right here, or even doing product B-roll and photography. Getting that shallow depth of field is a really sought after look. Now, a higher f-stop number like f16 actually creates a really small aperture opening on your lens, and that's going to let in less light. So this can actually be helpful on bright sunny days to cut out light from hitting your sensor so you can actually get correct exposure if it's too bright outside. But this is also going to produce a wider depth of field, so it's going to keep more of your scene in focus. This can be really helpful for shooting landscape photography or video, or really just any situation in which you want more of your frame in focus. Now, lenses can either have a constant aperture or a variable aperture. Now, constant aperture lenses will apply to all prime lenses, as well as more expensive lenses that are designed so that when you zoom in, your aperture isn't going to change values at all. But variable aperture lenses, on the other hand, change their aperture as you zoom into tighter focal lengths. And this is especially common on the standard kit lenses that are shipped with most of these cameras, because it's just more affordable to make lenses in this fashion. So as you check out this kit lens that I put on my Sony camera, as you zoom in from 18 millimeters to 55 millimeters, my aperture is actually going to automatically stop down from 3.5 to 5.6, which reduces the amount of light hitting my sensor. So it's really important to know whether your lens has a constant aperture or not, because it actually is going to affect the rest of your camera settings. Now let's talk about the difference between a full frame lens and an APS-C or crop sensor lens. So some lenses are designed to work with a larger sensor, like a full frame sensor, and then others are designed to work with smaller APS-C crop sensor format cameras. And what's really key about this distinction is that when you're using an APS-C camera, regardless of the lens you put on it, whether it's a full frame design lens or an APS-C, your effective field of view is actually going to change because of the size of the sensor. So this is known as crop factor. Maybe you've heard this phrase before, which refers to the multiplier that you'll add to whatever lens you're shooting on when you're using an APS-C camera. Now, if that confuses you, you're not alone. Let's break it down really simply. So take this 20 millimeter lens, for example. On a full frame camera, this 20 millimeter lens would give you a true 20 millimeter field of view. Makes sense, right? It's 20 millimeters, it should be 20. But when you put the same lens on a crop sensor camera, you're gonna multiply the focal length by 1.5x. And that will be the case on Sony and Nikon and Fuji and most of the camera brands, except for Canon, which Canon is weird, and you would multiply it by 1.6 times on all of Canon's cameras. So that means by putting a 20 millimeter lens on a APS-C camera, you're actually getting a 30 millimeter field of view because of the difference in sensor size. So the main takeaway here is if you like the wide field of view you get when you're shooting on a full frame camera, if you want that same field of view, you're gonna have to shoot on even wider lenses on APS-C. So something like 10 millimeters or 16 millimeters is gonna get you that wider look when you're shooting on crop sensor cameras. What's also interesting is I shoot on Sony cameras, and you can actually place any full frame lens on a crop sensor camera and it's gonna work just fine. But when I put an APS-C lens on my full frame camera, you can see quite a bit of vignetting around the edges because that lens isn't designed to shoot with such a large sensor, so you're gonna get some vignetting when you do that. Most full frame cameras do actually have an APS-C crop mode that you can turn the camera into, and now you're able to use APS-C lenses more effectively. And if any of that just confused you, please drop a comment down below and we'll be sure to help you out. Alrighty, so now we're gonna talk about all things focusing, starting with autofocus versus manual focus. So not every lens is gonna have autofocus, especially really large cinema lenses or even older vintage lenses. Maybe you have like a film camera that you're adapting a lens from, that lens might not have autofocus. Nowadays though, most lenses actually do have autofocus capabilities, so you don't have to manual focus your lenses. Most of the time you're gonna use autofocus for recording video or taking photos, but sometimes manually focusing your lens is nice because it can ensure that your focus position is not gonna change no matter what is happening in your camera frame. I actually use manual focus probably on like a weekly basis when I'm recording B-roll, because there are times where I feel like my camera's autofocus is almost too fast or too snappy, and sometimes swapping into manual focus can just give me more control over what my focus is doing. There's also something called minimum focusing distance, and every lens has a closest distance that it's able to focus on. And if your subject is closer than this minimum focusing distance, your camera won't be able to focus on that subject anymore. So for example, this 24-70 Sony lens has a minimum focus distance of 0.38 meters or 1.25 feet. So you'll see this number on your lens most of the time. So in order for this lens to be in focus, I have to be a minimum of 1.25 feet away in order for it to actually hit focus. So just take a look at whatever lens you have and check out its minimum focusing distance. And if you need a lens that is able to focus really close on a subject, then you're gonna wanna look at what is called a macro lens to get those really close detail shots. And the last focus thing I'll talk about is focus breathing. So some lenses, especially ones that are a little bit more cheaply made, experience what's called focus breathing. And this is kind of a slight change in a lens's field of view when you change your focus position. So as you shift between really close and far subjects, your frame almost might look like it's subtly zooming in or out, which can be kind of confusing if you don't know what's going on. Well, it's probably the focus breathing happening with your lens. It's especially noticeable when you're recording video, and it can actually be pretty distracting to the viewer, so ideally you want to minimize this if you can. Some cameras, like my Sony a7 IV for example, have a setting called focus breathing compensation, where it will use software to correct for some of that focus breathing, which is actually a pretty cool setting, and you can turn that on if your camera has it. Otherwise, if you're using a lens that has really bad focus breathing, you can swap it into manual focus, and that will eliminate focus breathing entirely. So those are a few really important focusing features you need to know about your camera lens. Now, in terms of getting stable footage or photos, some lenses actually feature lens stabilization, which can help reduce vibrations and micro jitters that you get when operating a camera. So this can be especially helpful when you're shooting handheld and you just want to still have decently smooth footage. Some lenses actually even have a physical switch where you can turn lens stabilization on and off really quickly if you don't want to use it, which is pretty neat. And an important note here is that not every lens features lens stabilization, and you will usually have to pay a little bit more money when buying a lens that has this feature. And just so you know, lens stabilization is different from IBIS, or in-body image stabilization, on your camera. So you actually can have one without the other. Your lens might have stabilization, but your camera doesn't have in-body stabilization, and vice versa. Or you can sometimes have both, and that's gonna give you super stable footage. Now, most lenses will also come with a lens hood, which will screw on to the front of your lens to block out unwanted light from hitting your camera sensor. So this actually can be really helpful if you are recording outdoors and the sun is shining really brightly and maybe coming towards your lens. Sometimes that can produce an unwanted camera flare, so screwing on your lens hood can really help with that. Also on the front of your camera lens are some threads so you can screw on filters to your lens. So on your lens, usually you'll see a logo indicating the thread size of the lens that you're using. So this number right here, say 82, means that you'll need to purchase an 82mm filter to attach to this lens. There are also things called step up or step down rings that allow you to convert the thread size of your lens to a higher or lower number so that you can actually use different size filters with your lens. This is actually a little hack that I use sometimes if I only want to buy one specific filter and I don't want to buy that one filter for every size lens that I have, then I'll just buy some step down rings and adapt the filter to my smaller lenses. And this saves me money, which I love saving money. So that's how thread sizes work. We'll link some filters and step-up rings down in the description below. So with all of this information, what is a lens that you might want to pick up first? Well, typically the easiest lens to get as your first lens would be a kit lens. So these are typically the lenses that are shipped with these different camera bodies, and they're usually pretty cheap. You can get them for about $100, maybe $150 add-on to your camera when you purchase it, and that's a pretty good starting point. If you're ready to upgrade your lenses a little bit and you're on the APS-C format, the two lenses that I'd recommend you look at first are the Sigma 16 18mm f1.4 lens, which is a beautiful lens that'll let in a bunch of light for shooting in lower light situations, and also with that lower aperture value is going to give you a really shallow depth of field for beautiful looking shots. There's also the Sigma 18 to 50mm f2.8 lens, and that constant 2.8 aperture is going to be really helpful for not having to change your exposure so much when you're zooming in and out, and that 18 to 50mm range will be a really versatile option for the APS-C format. If you're on full frame camera systems, one of my favorite lenses is this Viltrox 20mm f2.8 full frame lens. It's super budget as well. It's like $158 or $170 depending on when you buy it. It's really budget friendly, and honestly, optically, it looks pretty solid. I also love the Tamron 28 to 75, which is very similar to the Sigma because it has a constant 2.8 aperture and it's a similar zoom range on the full frame format. That 28 to 75 will be a really similar field of view to what the Sigma 18 to 50 would be on APS-C. So those are just a few lens options to get you started. If you do want to check out some other lens options, I have 6 of my favorite budget lenses for Sony cameras in this video right here that you can check out on screen, and we'll see you in the next one.